Now let's talk about the interview process. I personally love this process. I think it's actually really fun. However, interviews can be very stressful also. So that's why it's really important to prepare your message based on the research you've done and what you want the interviewer to know. So before you get to the interview process, if you receive an email or a phone call that offers you an interview, you want to make sure that you do the research about the position and about the company before you start talking to those people who are going to hire you, because it will become apparent that you have not, if in fact you have not done that research. Some ways to do this are to look up the company website, to look up other job titles that are the same, to look up if there's a hiring search committee chair, make sure you know what they do. Also the other member, if you might have like a committee that interviews you, or you might have a panel, or you might have a one-on-one. We'll talk about that in a second, but you want to make sure that you know as much information as you possibly can about those people that are interviewing you. You also need to anticipate questions. So this is where I ask you to imagine yourself as the interviewer and what you would want to know if you were hiring someone for the position that you're applying for. Some examples, there are more in your book if you want to look at that, but some examples here of common interview questions that I personally have been asked as an interviewee before are give an example of a time you failed. That's a tricky one, and you want to make sure that you answer in a way that you give a complete answer of a time that you failed, but also talk about how you like either redeemed yourself from that failure or what resulted from that failure and make it into a positive spin. What another example is, what's your biggest weakness? Same thing. If you want to play the line well, in that if you were asked this question and you know that you have a hard time being on time, I would not say I have a hard time being on time. Or I'm always late. I wouldn't say that necessarily. I would say something a little bit more ambiguous, such as sometimes I run a little bit behind schedule because I'm trying to accomplish XYZ. Give examples, right? Another hard question to answer is, how do you manage conflict in the workplace? So be ready to give examples for this stuff too. And this is unique to your experience, right? And then another one, why did you apply for this position? I think this is probably the hardest one because, like, you know, in your own mind and your own heart, why you applied for that position. But it's sometimes hard to put that into words. And also, if you only applied for that position because of the money or because you need a job, maybe say it with more finesse than that. Make it about the company, how your values align with the company's values, if in fact they do, things like that. And also, it's important to script your answers, but not in a way that makes you seem inauthentic. Authenticity is really important in your interview process, and that's why people go through this process. So some ways that you can script your answers. It's not necessarily about like writing out answers, right? It's about how, like, the techniques in which you respond. So for example, you want to directly answer the question, then you want to back your answer up with an example, and then you want to connect the answer back to the position or company. So if you are interviewing for a position as the assistant director of communications at a startup company called, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, and they ask you, what would you like to achieve in the first 90 days of your employment? You would have a direct answer saying, I would like to roll out a campaign aligned with insert value of company. And then you would give an example. For example, I would start creating monthly newsletters, for highlighting employees, I don't know, whatever it is. And then you might connect it back to the position and company and maybe their values by saying something like, if we did this, we could increase your bottom line, your or we could reinforce your mission statement, or we could evaluate and analyze how people are viewing your company. Just make sure that you go through this 3-step process, and that will ensure that you're successful in your interviewing skills. Further, there are different types of interviews. Mock interviews are really useful. This is what you do with like your friends. Give them or like ask them to look up some common common interview questions, and then have a little sit down and mock interview so that you can at least get in the right headspace before that interview starts. Because if you don't practice, it's usually pretty clear that you have not like been ready, or you're not ready for that interview, which means you're probably not ready for that job, at least in the eyes or the perception of the prospective employer. There are also telephone interviews or video conferences, a lot of Zoom or Google Meets, things like that. These are usually the first phase interviews. So they're just getting like a meet and greet. I call it vibe checking. They're seeing if it's a definite no. And then if you pass that step, or maybe they're checking your qualifications too. But if you get past that step, then it's usually a second phase, face-to-face interview. And this is usually one-on-one or those panel interviews, like I said before. So like I said, make sure you do your research on the people who are interviewing you. Usually you will know who is interviewing you before you have that interview. So go in doing some research on those people who are going to be in the room with you. As for appearance, I have some different thoughts about this personally, but and this is changing over time, but we always want to look professional. And there are several ways to do that. If you have long hair, for example, you might pull it back, but that's not necessary. It's like this is where I disagree with your book in some ways. If there are certain parts of your personality that shine through with your social cues, and those are important to you, then I think that that's something that should not be hidden. For example, tattoos. If you have tattoos, some companies, a lot more recently than not, are not, they don't really care as much. It's not a negative thing. And sometimes it's even, self-expression is encouraged, right? So that's kind of my stance on it. But the main thing is always look professional. You don't show up to an interview with sweatpants on and a tank top, or you want to make sure that you look pulled together, whatever that looks like, but be authentic to yourself too. Lastly, salary questions should not be talked about in the first 2 interviews. These questions should be held until the negotiation phase, which we're going to talk about next. If they ask what your salary expectations are, then be vague and answer a little bit higher than what you expect. That way they'll come down a little bit and it'll be what you want. So we'll next talk about the follow-up and the negotiation.